Tonight, we turn our attention to a profession that, even today, inspires mild dread, awkward small talk, and the haunting scent of antiseptic. But back in the 1800s, oh, it was so much worse. Because if you think going to the dentist is unpleasant now, imagine doing it when anesthesia was optional, sterilization was theoretical, and half your patients believed in ghosts more than they believed in germs. This is the soft-spoken story of Victorian dentistry. A tale filled with rattling tools, musty waiting rooms, and toothaches that could genuinely get you sent to the afterlife, or at the very least to a barber with a saw. So, before we apply any metaphoric chloroform and recline your metaphorical chair, you know the routine. Click subscribe so you don't miss the next sleepy tale of discomfort. Like the video if you've ever felt judged by a toothbrush. And drop a comment with your time and location, just so the ghosts of Victorian molar removers can find you later. Ready? Deep breaths. Let's open wide and slip gently into the molasses-slow world of extremely questionable oral care. Let's suppose for a moment that it's the year 1841. You've just finished your apprenticeship as a cooper, or a lamplighter, or some other trade that involves splinters and repetitive motion. Life is tolerable if you ignore the soot in your lungs and the slightly haunted look in everyone's eyes, but something's calling to you, a higher purpose, a noble profession that will earn you respect, money, and the chance to prod people in the mouth with metal hooks. Congratulations, you've just become a dentist. Except there's one small issue. There are no dental schools. There are no licenses. There is no standard training, curriculum, or even general agreement about whether teeth should be removed or politely left alone to rot in peace. Becoming a dentist in the 19th century was, more often than not, a matter of enthusiasm over competence. You didn't study for years. You watched someone else yank out a molar once, bought a pair of pliers from a pawn shop, and declared yourself ready for business. And it worked. Somehow. The profession of dentistry, in its Victorian form, sat somewhere between folk healing and public performance art. In fact, many dentists started off as travelling salesmen. You'd set up a booth at a county fair, sell a bottle of miracle tonic, and while your audience was marvelling at your sideburns and waistcoat, you'd casually extract a tooth on stage to demonstrate your qualifications. Yes, dentistry used to be a spectator sport, and if you weren't a showman, you might be the local barber. Barbers, after all, were already handy with blades and unearned confidence. For a small additional fee, they'd shave your beard, drain your blood, and remove the offending bicuspid, often all in the same visit. You'd go in for a trim and leave looking cleaner, paler, and slightly shorter on the left side of your jaw. Still, if you were serious about dentistry, like, I own an actual chair, serious, then you could invest in some of the most cutting-edge technology available. A foot-powered drill, an extraction key shaped like a ship's anchor, and a chair that tilted slightly backward, but only when it felt like it. There was also the matter of fashion. A well-respected dentist needed to look the part. Waistcoats were essential. Cravats, optional but encouraged. Bloodstains on the sleeves, inevitable. It was hard to stay pristine when your daily routine involved leaning into someone's screaming face while gripping a metal crank that looked like it belonged in a dungeon. Let's not forget the marketing. With no regulations to stop you, you could print up pamphlets claiming your services cured everything from toothache to melancholy. Some even promised improved moral character after extractions, as if removing a molar would also remove your sinful tendencies. But perhaps the most ironic thing about being a dentist in the Victorian era was that you couldn't afford to be squeamish, but you also couldn't afford to look too excited about your work. No one wanted to trust their dental future to a man grinning about incisors. You had to project just the right amount of boredom and authority, like a man who's seen 12 infected gums before breakfast and has exactly enough laudanum to get through 13 more. Of course, this assumed you had a building. Many did not. Dentists were often itinerant, travelling from town to town, knocking on doors, offering cleanings, fillings, and extractions. Some even worked out of general stores. Others just had a sign, a bag of tools, and a business model based entirely on people being in too much pain to ask questions. There were no x-rays, no charts, no gloves, no high-speed suction hoses. Just you, a pair of tongs, a bowl of whiskey, and a vague hope that the tooth you were pulling wasn't the wrong one. Still, the job came with a strange sort of prestige. You might not be a proper doctor, but you were close enough. You wore spectacles. You said things like incisor and premolar and open wider. You understood the delicate balance between bone, nerve, and brute force. You were, in a way, a craftsman of the mouth, a sculptor of discomfort, and so you persisted, day after day, mouth after mouth, until your hands grew steady, your coat grew stiff, and your tolerance for screams grew disturbingly high. You had become a Victorian dentist, not because you wanted to, not because anyone asked you to, but because it was there, and because someone, somewhere, always had a tooth that needed pulling. Now, shall we move on to your equipment? There's a certain elegance to modern dental equipment, gleaming stainless steel, ergonomic grips, tools that hum softly like they're sorry to be there. And then, there's Victorian dental gear, which looked less like medical instruments and more like something you'd find in a pirate's treasure chest, or a medieval torture exhibit that had a discount section. The tools of the 19th century dentist were built for function, not subtlety. In fact, many of them seemed expressly designed to make patients rethink their life choices the moment they sat down, assuming there even was a chair. Some dentists simply asked you to lean back against a wall and hope gravity was on your side. Comfort, like sterilization, was a future luxury. Let's begin with the tooth key. This was not a charming nickname for a delicate instrument. No, it was a literal key-shaped device, complete with a handle, shaft, and a rotating claw at the end. The concept was simple and completely horrifying. You jammed the claw down into the gum, hooked it around the tooth, and then turned. Not unlike opening a stubborn door, except the door was your molar, and the creaking sound was your soul leaving your body. To be fair, the tooth key was considered innovative. Before that, many extractions were done with fingers, or with pliers borrowed from a carpenter's shed. The key, despite its obvious flaws, at least suggested that someone had put thought into the process. Even if that thought was mostly, what if we made a tool that combines dentistry with wrenching livestock from a fence? There was also the pelican, an earlier and even less merciful cousin of the key. It had a screw mechanism, a fixed claw, and a design inspired by the idea that maybe if you couldn't pull a tooth, you could simply coax it into leaving. It was eventually retired, not because it stopped being horrifying, but because even Victorian dentists thought it was a bit much. Then came the forceps, cruder, heavier, and far more indiscriminate than their modern descendants. Early dental forceps didn't curve delicately around the tooth. They gripped like they had somewhere else to be. They were iron, cold, and suspiciously similar to the ones used to shoe horses. But they got the job done, if you defined the job as removing something vaguely in the vicinity of what you were aiming for. Of course, Victorian dentists didn't only pull teeth. Sometimes they tried to preserve them, which was adorable. For drilling, they had a hand-cranked device that looked like it belonged in a carpenter's toolbox. You'd hold it like a brace and bit, point it at a decaying tooth, and rotate steadily, while the patient did their best not to pass out or bite you out of pure instinct. The drills had no water cooling, no numbing gel, and absolutely no sense of shame. If the patient flinched, which they did constantly, you just reset your aim and carried on, like someone drilling into an especially opinionated block of wood. It was a race between infection, exhaustion, and whether or not the dentist's arm gave out first. For fillings, the options were rudimentary, gold if you were rich, tin if you were lucky. Sometimes wax or resin if the dentist had a creative streak and low standards. Amalgam, the lovely mixture of mercury, silver, and wishful thinking, became common despite the small issue of, well, mercury. But Victorian science wasn't overly concerned with side effects. If it didn't kill you outright, it was probably fine. And what about sanitation, you ask? A fair question. The answer is, there wasn't any. Tools were wiped on aprons, rinsed in teacups, or left on windowsills to bask in the sun like feral cats. The prevailing wisdom seemed to be that exposure to the general public would toughen your immune system, or at least hasten the inevitable. Sterilization as a concept wouldn't arrive for another few decades, and even then, it was met with suspicion and mild offense. Anesthesia, of course, existed, sort of, but ether and chloroform weren't standard. Most dental work relied on good old-fashioned alcohol, biting down on a stick, or hoping your body went into shock before things got interesting. If you flailed too much, you might be restrained with leather straps, or gently leaned on by a robust assistant named Arthur, who once worked in a slaughterhouse. And yet, despite all this, people kept going to dentists, not because they wanted to, but because the alternative, letting a toothache progress into a jaw infection followed by death and probably a wildly inaccurate obituary, was just slightly less appealing. The tools were blunt, the hands were firm, and the methods were best described as intuitively alarming. But they kept people chewing, or at least gumming their way through stew. So next time you recline in a padded dental chair and listen to the gentle hum of a precision ultrasonic scaler, spare a thought for the brave souls who once stared into the eyes of a man with tongs, a cravat, and the burning determination of someone who read half a pamphlet and decided that teeth were a calling. If you've ever had a cavity filled and found yourself silently praising the marvel of modern anesthetics, you are not alone. Most of us, when confronted with a tiny jab of lidocaine and the gentle hum of a drill, experience a flicker of gratitude toward 21st century medicine. But in the 1800s, pain relief was less science and more spiritual test. To begin with, let's dispel the myth that Victorian dentistry was performed entirely without anaesthetic. That's not strictly true. There were options. They just ranged from mildly effective to borderline existential. The most accessible form of pain management, of course, was alcohol, and not the dainty medicinal kind. We're talking about aggressive, rot-gut spirits poured into tin cups and downed in gulps that were less about savouring and more about stealing one's soul for the experience ahead. Whiskey, brandy, gin, whatever could be obtained quickly and in questionably large quantities. Patients were advised to take a stiff drink before the procedure, which, in practice, meant the patient would arrive already 3 sheets to the wind, slurring their complaints, and occasionally attempting to flirt with the dentist's overworked assistant. This helped, in theory. Alcohol dulled the nerves. It also dulled judgment, impulse control, and the ability to sit upright. But these were small trade-offs, really. The second most popular method of pain relief was simply screaming, not metaphorically, literally. It was not unusual for passers-by to hear operatic howls wafting from the upper floor of a barber surgeon's shop. Many dentists operated from rooms above general stores or butcher shops because zoning laws hadn't been invented yet, and customer experience was a concept reserved for the far future. So as someone's bicuspid was being encouraged to leave the building with a rusty implement and considerable force, it was perfectly normal for children in the street to glance up and remark, "Ah, Tuesday again." More determined patients, the stoics, the stubborn, or the deeply repressed, attempted white-knuckled silence. These were the brave souls who gritted their teeth, except when that was the problem, and attempted to transcend pain by sheer denial. Occasionally they would bite through a leather strap or crack a chair arm. Dentists viewed this as a good sign. If the patient could still fight the furniture, they were probably fine. For the wealthy and those with a taste for experimentation, there was chloroform, Administered via a cloth soaked in the substance and held over the nose and mouth, chloroform could knock a person out quickly. Unfortunately, it could also knock them out permanently. Dosing was a delicate art, typically learned by trial, error, and an alarming number of funerals. Still, it was more precise than the alternative, which was just yelling at the patient to hold still for heaven's sake. Ether was also in use, though it had a reputation for making people vomit, flail, or wax poetic mid-sedation. More than one dental patient under ether began to sing, declare love for an inanimate object, or recite strange poetry about geese. This was seen as charming until it became dangerous, at which point the dentist would apply a more effective remedy: shouting. Children, naturally, were treated with gentleness, by which I mean sugar-coated lies, gentle bribes, and the promise of a boiled sweet afterward, assuming they didn't swallow it whole in shock. Pediatric dentistry wasn't a specialty yet. There was no child-sized equipment. There were just smaller patients and regular-sized pliers. Encouragement was minimal. Phrases like "this won't hurt a bit" were used liberally and dishonestly. And then there were the patients who opted for no pain relief whatsoever. Whether due to lack of funds, time, or a general distrust of newfangled nonsense, these brave souls simply showed up and took it. Dentists admired them, patients envied them. Dentists also worried slightly that these people might be unhinged, but as long as they paid, no one asked too many questions. Recovery, such as it was, often took place in the back alley or on the stoop, where the patient would sit, head in hands, wondering if they had in fact survived, or if this was some new and poorly lit version of the afterlife. Instructions were vague. Rinse with whiskey was common. Avoid chewing was another. But frankly, most patients weren't keen to eat ever again. And so, the legacy of pain management in Victorian dentistry remains. A noble blend of improvisation, questionable liquids, and the human ability to endure far more than it should ever have to. If you've ever felt a flicker of self-consciousness reclining in a sleek, quiet dental chair while the hygienist asks about your weekend with a gloved hand in your mouth, take heart. Things used to be worse, much worse. Because in Victorian times, dental work wasn't just personal. It was a public spectacle, a shared experience, a group activity that no one asked to attend, and everyone left emotionally damaged by. Let's begin with the setting. Dentists, when they weren't also serving as barbers, apothecaries, or vaguely threatening salesmen of tooth powders, typically operated in storefronts, market stalls, or their very own front parlours. Privacy was not the priority. In fact, in many cases, it simply wasn't a thing. You didn't go to the back room for your dental needs. You sat near the window, in full view of the street, often beside someone buying leeches, or just behind a family purchasing pickled turnips. The idea was simple. Visibility was marketing. A patient mid-extraction, face frozen in that universally human expression of "I have made a terrible mistake," was a free advertisement. If the dentist could successfully yank a molar from an uncooperative jaw without killing anyone, or at least without too much collateral blood loss, that was good for business. Onlookers would nod approvingly and think, yes, this seems like a place I too could be physically assaulted by medical implements. It was not uncommon for crowds to gather, especially on market days when foot traffic was high and entertainment options were limited to either watching a man pretend to wrestle a goose or seeing Mrs. Wilberforce finally get that rotten tooth removed after 6 months of public complaint. The extraction itself was often preceded by a bit of showmanship. The dentist might twirl his pliers dramatically. He might tell a short story about a particularly stubborn incisor. In some cases, he would slap the patient gently on the cheek, not out of malice, but to get the blood flowing, or maybe both. Seating was not always a guarantee. If the patient was lucky, there would be a chair, wooden, creaky, and completely incapable of reclining. If not, the patient might be asked to kneel on a cushion, lean against a barrel, or simply stand very still and try not to faint forward. There were no straps, no bite guards, and certainly no sense of legal liability. It was an exercise in personal resolve and grip strength. For particularly dramatic procedures, such as the removal of several teeth in one sitting, or an especially infected molar with a stubborn root, the dentist might invite bystanders to observe the curvature, pointing out the tooth as it emerged like some sort of unholy vegetable from the earth. The crowd would lean in, someone would swoon, and a child would ask a loud question that made everyone uncomfortable. And it wasn't just the extraction that drew attention. Oh no. The preamble, the wheedling, the bargaining, the deep sighs of those trying to psych themselves up, was also part of the show. Imagine trying to maintain dignity while negotiating with someone about the number of teeth you might be able to lose and still be employable, while a baker and his apprentice looked on, munching bread and offering unsolicited advice. The screams, naturally, were the highlight. Some patients tried to be quiet, attempting to stifle the agony behind a gentlemanly grimace. Others embraced the performance. There were moans, sobs, and sometimes operatic yells that echoed across cobbled streets and through the open windows of nearby establishments. The city, it seemed, was always humming with the sound of someone discovering just how many nerves a tooth had. In rural areas, the experience could be even more rustic. Travelling tooth drawers would set up at fairs or village greens with a small wooden box and a stool. Their qualifications were often decorative, perhaps a sign reading "painless tooth removal" in whimsical script, followed by a list of past customers who were probably fine. These extractions were performed outdoors, sometimes on picnic blankets, sometimes while ducks wandered by. If the patient was lucky, a fiddle might play in the background. If unlucky, a goat might knock over the whiskey bottle mid-procedure. And let us not forget the souvenirs. It was fashionable for some dentists to display their greatest hits. A jar of removed teeth kept on the counter like pickled nightmares. Children were encouraged to look. Sometimes the dentist would tap the glass and say, "See that one? Took half the jaw with it." It was, in its own way, educational. So why didn't people demand privacy? Why didn't they revolt against this open-air trauma parade? Because, quite simply, they didn't know any different. Pain was expected. Modesty was a luxury, and dental procedures were not seen as medical events so much as social ones. Things to be endured together, like bad weather or a shared loaf of particularly chewy bread. South, you've lost a tooth, or several. Or perhaps you went for a simple molar extraction and left the dentist's shop minus an alarming percentage of your jawline. Maybe you blacked out during the process. Maybe you wept. Maybe you screamed and the neighbour's cat hasn't come back since. No matter how the extraction unfolded, one thing is certain. You are now what the Victorians delicately referred to as visibly dental deficient, which means it's time to talk about replacement options. And if you think your choices included porcelain veneers, polished implants, or painless acrylic fittings, oh dear reader, you are clearly from the future. In the 1800s, getting your smile back meant either lying to yourself, lying to others, or shoving something into your mouth and hoping it stayed there through lunch. Let's start with the materials, shall we? Early Victorian dentures were often made from animal bone, ivory, human teeth, or, if you were very fancy and very dead inside, hippopotamus ivory. Yes, it turns out that large aquatic herbivores had a small but vital role to play in the restoration of British grins. A walrus molar, a boar's tusk. Sure, why not? If it could be filed into a vaguely tooth-like shape, someone somewhere tried it. Whether or not it fit comfortably was negotiable. Then there were the human teeth. These were, shall we say, second-hand, sometimes called Waterloo teeth. Many were sourced from battlefields, collected from fallen soldiers, and shipped off in bulk to be installed in the mouths of those who could pay. There is, quite literally, a non-zero chance that a smiling debutante in 1850 was showing off the incisors of a French infantryman. Romance, after all, takes many forms, but not all teeth came from war. Some came from enterprising donors. The poor, the desperate, the deeply unbothered would sometimes sell their own healthy teeth to dentists, who would then install them into the mouths of wealthier clients. This practice came with all the modern hygiene protocols of licking a door handle. It's unclear how often these teeth were disinfected, but given the general relationship Victorians had with bacteria, i.e., total denial, it's fair to assume the answer is not very. And then came the fittings. You'd think, having acquired a mouthful of human or hippo-derived ivory, the least a person could hope for would be a snug fit. But dentures in this era were less precision instruments and more portable puzzles. Springs were sometimes used to clamp the top and bottom rows together, relying on your jaw muscles to keep them shut. Unfortunately, these springs could also backfire, literally snapping the dentures out of place mid-conversation and sending them clattering across the room. Nothing says elegance like having to excuse yourself to retrieve your own teeth from under a piano. If you didn't have full dentures, but were simply missing a few select teeth, say, the entire left side of your smile, you might opt for partial plates, which were held in place with wire, gut strings, or, in some cases, pure willpower. These were custom-fitted, in the sense that someone vaguely eyeballed your mouth and then hammered something together in the back room with pliers and hope. Comfort was not a guarantee. In fact, it was rarely even a consideration. Early dentures were stiff, unwieldy, and capable of producing blisters, infections, and a kind of biting misalignment that turned chewing into an upper body workout. Speaking and eating required practice. You had to relearn how to move your face in a way that wouldn't launch your teeth into your soup, or someone else's. Despite all this, people still wore them. Why? Because dental shame is eternal. In a society obsessed with appearance and class, a full set of teeth, even if they weren't originally yours, or even the same species as you, was a sign of health, youth, and affluence. It said, "I am not dying yet, please invite me to dinner." And dinner was important, especially if you planned to smile through it. You've survived the wrenching. You've weathered the screech of steel against enamel, the oddly specific pain of a molar being removed while the dentist casually discusses the weather. And now you've been fitted with a charming set of someone else's teeth, possibly held together with gut string copper wire and the moral support of Queen Victoria's disapproving ghost. Naturally, you're hungry. But before you can even think about enjoying a meal, it's time to consider what eating actually looked like in the 19th century, particularly for someone nursing an aching jaw and a mouthful of medieval prosthetics. Let's begin with the basics. Victorian food was not known for being easy on the teeth. This was not the era of soft cheeses and pillowy brioche. It was the age of boiled beef, sweat-heavy puddings, aggressively crusted bread, and vegetables that had been cooked until they forgot their own names. Everything was overdone, over-seasoned, or not seasoned at all. Every bite required effort. Every chew was a gamble. Take, for instance, the national obsession with mutton, a meat that was not only tough, but proudly so. If it didn't take 3 days to chew, it wasn't properly British. Even when slow-cooked for hours in a heavy iron pot, it somehow emerged from the process firmer, denser, and more personally insulting than when it went in. Now imagine trying to tackle a slab of this with your rented teeth clattering like porcelain teacups in a stagecoach. Then there were meat pies, which, while softer, had their own hazards. Hidden bones, questionable gristle, surprise textures. If you were lucky, the worst thing you bit down on was a partially dissolved bay leaf. If you were unlucky, it was a bullet from the original source. Bread, meanwhile, was its own special form of dental sabotage, made dense, hard, and dry enough to be used as structural support in modest architecture. If it didn't cause dental damage on the way in, it certainly made your new teeth squeak and groan under the strain. And once it got stuck in the springs of your dentures, good luck. You'd need a small crochet hook, a servant with steady hands, and a strong sense of dignity loss. Now, let's consider vegetables, theoretically softer. In practice, they ranged from boiled into mushy oblivion to still somehow crunchy but tasteless, carrots that doubled as chew toys, cabbage that wept softly when served, peas that rolled straight off your fork and mocked you with their freedom, and the ever-present turnip, an item that defied every attempt at palatability and frequently made surprise appearances in every course, including dessert. Puddings, you ask? Perhaps you imagine a moment of relief, something soft, something yielding. Oh no, this is Victorian pudding, which means it was probably stuffed with beef fat, dried fruit, breadcrumbs, and then steamed until it achieved the density of a barbell. These were not spoon puddings. These were cut-it-with-a-saw puddings. Puddings that fought back. Puddings that remembered Waterloo. And then there was tea. Ah, tea. The one redeeming pleasure of the day. Hot, soothing, and unlikely to shatter your bicuspids. Unless, of course, it was accompanied by biscuits, which, in the Victorian sense, were basically edible roof tiles. Dipping them in your tea helped, but only marginally. Often they remained as unyielding as the family that disapproved of your dental decisions. Eating, therefore, became a performance, a balancing act between nourishment and embarrassment. Chew too aggressively, and your teeth might spring loose, launching across the table like a startled crab. Chew too gently, and nothing ever broke down, leading to a dinner of slow internal resentment and public mastication panic. There were social expectations too, to chew quietly, to eat politely, to avoid grimacing, all while trying to force a handful of wire-bound ivory to handle an under-seasoned cut of cow that had the texture of a medieval boot. It was the Olympics of dental diplomacy. And so, dinner came and went, plates cleared, teeth still mostly in place, self-respect hanging on by a thread. You survived another meal. But tomorrow, another day of chewing, of second-hand molars and socially pressured mastication. There are many kinds of pain in this world. Emotional, spiritual, the existential anguish of seeing your reflection after a Victorian haircut. And then, far above them all, there is dental pain. That throbbing, dull, sharp, unrelenting reminder that your head is just a poorly designed container for nerves and regret. Now, in an age before Novocaine, before antibiotics, before basic human empathy from a medical professional, dental pain wasn't just an inconvenience. It was a lifestyle, a daily experience, a reminder that every bite of blackened toast was a wager and every yawn a risk. So what did you do if you had a toothache in the 1800s? You started, as most did, with denial. Maybe it's just something you ate, you'd say. Perhaps it's atmospheric pressure, or a result of your melancholic temperament. Maybe your tooth isn't dying. Maybe it's just brooding, like Lord Byron. Unfortunately, Byron never exploded mid-meal, and your tooth just might. Once you'd accepted that no, this wasn't going away, you turned to the most trusted figures in Victorian medicine, the apothecaries. These were men, always men, who combined the roles of pharmacist, therapist, and occasional amateur wizard. They worked in shops lined with mysterious jars, most filled with ingredients that sounded more like curses than cures. Oil of cloves, tincture of mercury, powdered unicorn horn, actually just suspiciously crushed seashells. Their go-to remedy for toothache, laudanum. Laudanum was a magical concoction of opium and alcohol, which is to say it worked brilliantly for nearly everything, except sobriety, accuracy of speech, or staying vertical for longer than 7 minutes. With a few drops under your tongue, your toothache transformed from agonizing reality to muffled background fuzz. Of course, you also forgot your address and your mother's name, but these were acceptable trade-offs. Other remedies included camphor, chloroform, and something ominously labelled tooth tincture, which was roughly 60% alcohol and 40% hope. Some preferred the homeopathic route, placing a heated onion on their cheek or chewing bark soaked in vinegar. These approaches had the benefit of making your pain worse in new and exciting ways. But let's say you couldn't afford apothecary potions. Let's say you were poor or frugal, or simply preferred your molars in a more natural state of collapse. That's when you turned to the folk cures. One popular method was putting a dead mouse in your mouth. Not a typo. A literal, actual mouse, recently expired, placed against the aching tooth, in the belief that its death energy, or just the sheer distraction of revulsion, would draw out the pain. And perhaps it did. Perhaps you were so focused on not screaming that the original ache simply slunk away out of embarrassment. Other favourites included gargling with brandy, which at least had the courtesy to taste good while being entirely useless. Sleeping on the side opposite the ache, which worked if your goal was to ignore the problem until death. Tying a toad to your jaw, which was great for local fashion statements and confusing your enemies. Of course, these methods did nothing for the underlying causes. Rampant decay, abscesses and infections that made your jaw swell like a poorly baked bread roll. But the 19th century wasn't especially fond of causes. It preferred distractions and narcotics. Now, on the rare occasion that your pain became unbearable, even through the fog of gin, opiates and spiritual resignation, you might finally be led to surgical extraction. This was an event, an experience, a memory you'd carry until your dying day if you survived the day itself. The dentist, or in many cases, the nearest blacksmith with a strong grip, would sit you down, open your mouth, and proceed with a process that could generously be called violent optimism. There were no numbing agents, no sterilization, just pliers, confidence, and the Victorian belief that discomfort built character. The process was simple. Grip the tooth, yank with commitment, and ignore the screaming. Blood was expected. Fractured roots were ignored. Infection was inevitable, and recovery involved hot compresses and more laudanum, followed by the whispered promise that perhaps, just perhaps, the pain wouldn't come back in the next 5 years. Spoiler, it usually did. Eventually, if you were lucky, the pain faded, or you forgot it in a haze of opium and mashed turnips. Either way, your mouth returned to a state of uneasy truce. One where you could smile again, though preferably not too widely, lest people notice the tooth gap you now referred to as a war wound. So yes, toothache in the Victorian era wasn't just pain, it was a rite of passage. A trial of spirit, a dental pilgrimage through tinctures, superstitions, and bite-sized tragedy. Naturally, after surviving the kind of dental procedure that leaves you tasting copper and reconsidering your life choices, the idea of preventative care starts to sound appealing. Unfortunately, in the 19th century, preventative care was a bit like unicorns or a sincere compliment from Queen Victoria, rumoured to exist but largely unavailable to the average citizen. Let's begin with toothpaste, if you can call it that. The Victorian concept of oral hygiene involved mixing together whatever was nearby and felt cleansing, regardless of whether it had any business being near a human mouth. Common ingredients included crushed charcoal, because nothing says fresh breath like ashes from your breakfast fire, salt, for that satisfying sting that says, I've made a mistake, brick dust, which was just what it sounds like, the powdered remains of buildings, effective at removing plaque, enamel, and hope. Some concoctions featured chalk, soot, or baking soda, the last of which might actually have done something helpful, if not for the fact it was usually mixed with turpentine, vinegar, or soap. Yes, soap, because if it made your dishes squeaky clean, surely it was fine for your molars. Entire families shared 1 bar of dental soap, often laced with mint, cloves, or some kind of citrus to cover the underlying taste of despair. You were expected to lather, scrub, rinse, and then go about your day, wondering why your tongue felt like it had gone to war, Toothbrushes? They existed, sort of. But unless you were wealthy, you probably didn't own one. And if you did, you likely shared it with your spouse, your children, possibly your neighbours, because toothbrushes were carved from bone, with bristles made from boar hair or horse mane, and they weren't cheap. They also weren't especially effective, unless your goal was to relocate plaque from one tooth to another. More rustic types skipped brushes altogether and opted for twigs, specifically chewing sticks made from aromatic trees like licorice or neem. You'd gnaw the end until it frayed, and then jab at your teeth like you were fencing with your own mouth. Strangely enough, this method sometimes worked better than actual brushes. But again, context. The bar was low. We're talking subterranean. Now, if your teeth were already not great, yellow, spotted, or vaguely moss-coloured, you might try your luck with a tooth powder. These were often sold in tins with wildly misleading claims like whitens instantly or prevents tooth rot. Many were mixtures of burnt alum, dried herbs, and questionable chalk derivatives. Some even contained arsenic, which, yes, is toxic, but apparently quite effective at whitening. Permanently. As for flossing, that delightful ritual of gliding silk between your teeth to remove hidden horrors, not a thing. Silk was expensive and most people weren't in the habit of investing in things that slid between their molars. If something got stuck between your teeth, say a pork rind or a small pebble, you removed it with a toothpick, which was usually communal and carved from wood, metal, or, if you were stylish, porcupine quill. These were available at dining establishments, occasionally chained to the table like medieval cutlery, presumably to discourage theft or impromptu swordplay. And speaking of style, there was also the matter of breath. Victorian breath was not a topic for polite society, but it certainly existed. The solution? Breath fresheners, including clove lozenges, which didn't mask odour so much as shout over it. Mint oil, applied directly to the tongue for maximum internal screaming. Or, failing all else, the good old-fashioned kerchief cough, where you simply exhaled into fabric and hoped no one noticed the smell of Victorian despair. Of course, the irony of all this effort was that cleaning your teeth in the 1800s often caused as much damage as leaving them dirty. Brushing too hard with brick dust? Congratulations, you've filed down your enamel to the consistency of a chalkboard, overdoing it with acidic rinses. You've just created the perfect habitat for oral collapse. But hey, at least your smile sparkled. Under candlelight, at just the right angle, through a thin veil of smoke and Victorian modesty. And yet, despite all this, there was something faintly charming about it. The sheer optimism of it all. The belief that with enough soap, salt, and communal bristle work, one could fend off the creeping rot of time, both dental and mortal. But what happens when the damage is too far gone? When no amount of charcoal or minty soap will silence the groan of a dying molar? Well then, my friend, you turn to replacement. Now, you might be thinking, surely, once the painful, crumbling teeth have been yanked out and you've bled enough to water a small Victorian herb garden, the worst is over. A reasonable thought. But also, wrong. The real terror has only just begun, because now you'll need replacements. And replacements, dear listener, in the Victorian era were not what you might call reassuring. Let's begin with materials. Modern dentures, as you may know, are made from durable acrylic resins and high-tech polymers, lovingly moulded and subtly tinted to match your natural look. Victorian dentures were made from ivory, typically from hippos, walruses, or elephants, porcelain, fragile and unsettlingly tooth-like, or, if you were truly lucky, actual human teeth. Yes, real teeth. Often harvested from the mouths of corpses or donated by the extremely poor in exchange for money, bread, or questionable life advice. There was, in fact, an entire economy dedicated to second-hand smiles. Among the most prestigious sources, the Battle of Waterloo. After the battle, enterprising individuals swept the fields, plucking the teeth from fallen soldiers, usually young, healthy men with relatively intact molars. These were then scrubbed, somewhat, sorted and mounted into ivory plates to create Waterloo teeth, a grim but fashionable status symbol in London society. A full set could cost more than a servant's annual wage, but who wouldn't want a mouthful of patriotism? The fit, of course, was terrible. There were no dental scans or alignment charts. The dentures were basically guesstimated to sit where your real teeth once did, affixed with springs, wire, or, in a particularly creative turn, rubber straps that looped around the back of your head. These held your new smile in place like a jaw-sized mousetrap, always a wrong word or sneeze away from launching across the dinner table. Speaking of dinner, eating with false teeth was more of an aspirational concept than a practical reality. Most wearers removed them for meals, resulting in a great deal of gumming, mashing, and stealthy soaking of bread in soup until it reached an edible slush. Public chewing, if attempted, was a dangerous game. Wearing dentures required practice, not just to speak or smile, but to maintain composure while your upper plate shifted ominously during polite conversation. It's difficult to flirt when your incisor plate clicks mid-sentence, or to deliver a stirring speech when your molars are trying to bail out of your mouth like disgruntled passengers abandoning a leaky ship. Of course, for those unable to afford Waterloo teeth or ivory monstrosities, there were other, more homemade solutions. Wood was sometimes carved into rudimentary plates. Animal teeth could be glued into a whittled frame. One could even insert metal pegs into the gum to anchor replacement teeth, though this usually led to infection, blood poisoning, and eventually death. But at least you died with a full set. Care for dentures wasn't exactly sanitary either. They were soaked overnight in vinegar, urine, or brandy, depending on your budget, your hygiene beliefs, and how much of your drinking supply you were willing to waste on oral accessories. Toothpaste was sometimes rubbed directly on the dentures using a piece of linen or, if you were very modern, a stiff wire brush. This often scraped off the decorative finish and left them looking like something exhumed from a cursed tomb. Yet even with the risk of slippage, infection, or unintentional projectile tooth, the pressure to replace one's smile remained strong. Because nothing said social failure quite like an empty mouth. Toothlessness was associated with poverty, aging, and a failure of moral character. Dentures, no matter how horrifying, were seen as a noble effort towards self-improvement, like wearing a corset made of wasps, or learning French despite a debilitating head injury. And for those who couldn't afford even the most basic prosthetic, well, you learned to mumble, you slurped your tea sideways, you became intimately familiar with pudding, and you tried, whenever possible, to laugh with your mouth closed. Of course, none of this really prevented the inevitable. No matter how many teeth you replaced, polished, or glued into place, the underlying problem remained. Nobody in the Victorian era truly understood oral health. Maybe with a lace-trimmed handkerchief folded over your folded hands, possibly with a few weeping relatives pretending not to argue about your will, and very likely, with a full set of false teeth. But here's the thing about Victorian funerals. Nothing ever really stayed where it was put. To begin, let's be clear, being buried with your dentures was common. After all, they were expensive, carefully crafted, and, much like a prized hat or a well-polished walking cane, they signalled status even in death. A full set of false teeth suggested that you had lived well enough to afford oral illusions and died respectably, despite the chronic constipation and moral repression. The problem, however, came after burial. Because much like modern recyclers of luxury handbags or vintage watches, the 19th century world had its own version of sustainable fashion, grave robbing, and what was often at the top of the shopping list. That's right, teeth. A surprisingly large number of posthumous dental extractions occurred during the Victorian era, Professional resurrectionists, a charming euphemism for people who dug up corpses for spare parts, were known to target freshly buried bodies not just for anatomy schools or gold fillings, but also for their well-preserved ivory chompers and Waterloo specials. Even honest undertakers, if one can call anyone surrounded by formaldehyde and financial opportunity truly honest, sometimes removed teeth before burial, particularly if the family had fallen behind on payments. That's right. In the 1800s, your dentures could be repoed. There were even documented cases of families retrieving teeth from deceased relatives to pass down to the next generation. A practical, if slightly haunting, tradition. Somewhat akin to inheriting a good armchair, but with more jaw curvature. It wasn't uncommon to hear phrases like, "These were grandpapa's bicuspids," uttered with pride and the faintest trace of gingivitis. Cemeteries themselves didn't help the situation. Many burial grounds were overcrowded, poorly maintained, or reused with alarming frequency. Coffins disintegrated, markers faded, and rainwater, ever a loyal saboteur, washed away more than just memories. In such settings, bones surfaced, teeth turned up in garden beds, and false dentures, dislodged by time and a poor understanding of soil composition, found their way into strange places. Museum drawers, apothecary jars, and on occasion, the open market. Yes, you could buy used dentures. Antique shops, second-hand stores, and certain less reputable dentists offered lightly pre-owned sets. Some were cleaned, some were not, but all carried a bit of history, and likely a few lingering bacteria. There was no legal regulation of dental reusability either, so if you thought the teeth being installed in your aching gums were freshly carved from the tusk of an ethical walrus, you may have been in for a surprise. They may, in fact, have already given speeches, dined at balls, or sung in choirs, several owners ago. And even if your dentures stayed with you, no theft, no family reclamation, no flood of teeth tumbling down the cemetery hill, they still outlived you. False teeth were practically immortal compared to the human body. Your ivory grin could remain intact for centuries, sitting cheerfully in a collapsed coffin while the rest of you returned to carbon. Archaeologists occasionally uncover these dental relics, often nestled among bones, buttons, and boots that nobody bothered to take off. They are sometimes displayed in museums, labelled delicately as Victorian dental prosthetics, where children point and grimace and adults pretend not to be fascinated. In many ways, it's comforting. A last memento of vanity, craftsmanship, and the human desire to look presentable, even while decomposing, but also a bit unsettling, because the real legacy of Victorian dentistry wasn't hygiene, or innovation, or even bravery in the face of pliers. It was a mouthful of borrowed teeth, and the quiet knowledge that somewhere out there, someone else might still be wearing yours. So now that you've survived the biting, the pulling, the wrenching, the grave robbing, and the slight chance that your new teeth once belonged to a local baroness who died unexpectedly of mysterious dental fatigue, you might be wondering, how did Victorians maintain their dental health? The answer lies in a dusty tin of misfortune called tooth powder. Toothpaste, the smooth and squeezable variety we know and occasionally forget to replace, was still decades away from polite society. In the mid-19th century, the goal of oral hygiene was less about fresh breath and more about controlled erosion. Dental care was aggressive, vaguely medieval, and mostly improvised with whatever the household hadn't already thrown in the fireplace. Tooth powder recipes were not standardized. They were invented in kitchens, whispered about in back alleys, and printed in obscure domestic guides with alarming confidence. Common ingredients included crushed brick dust, which offered a rugged exfoliation, and the slight chance of chipping your teeth into submission. Charcoal ash, scooped lovingly from last night's burnt potatoes, was considered purifying, possibly because you could no longer see the plaque under all the soot. Salt was another favourite. Sea salt, table salt, rock salt, really, any variety would do. especially if it made your gums sting, like they'd personally insulted your toothbrush. Chalk and powdered bone were also thrown in, as were burnt bread crusts, particularly the kind that had already hardened into near-ceramic density. For those with aspirations of elegance, a touch of ground coral or even pulverized pearl was the finishing flourish. Why settle for just sandpapering your teeth when you could do it with crushed jewellery? Then there was the actual tool, the Victorian toothbrush. It boasted a thick wooden handle, ergonomically designed to injure. The bristles, usually badger, sometimes horse, occasionally unlucky pig, were secured with glue and hope. These bristles had a tendency to leap off during brushing and take refuge between your molars, where they would remain until the next dental emergency. And yet many didn't have a toothbrush at all. Some used a clean rag, others gnawed on aromatic sticks or rubbed their gums with a cloth dipped in vinegar, salt, or their own guilt. If none of these were available, a moist finger would suffice, as long as one didn't mind the inevitable self-inflicted gum scraping. Mouthwash wasn't a sparkling swish of peppermint bliss. It was vinegar, sometimes fortified with urine, occasionally steeped with herbs, and always ready to burn through your remaining taste buds. Brandy was a common substitute, which had the dual benefit of sterilizing the mouth and dulling the realization that your teeth were actively retreating from your skull. Breath, predictably, was not a priority. Most Victorians existed in a cloud of their own making, and social etiquette evolved accordingly. Talking while facing someone directly was discouraged. Handkerchiefs were deployed with strategic frequency. People carried small bouquets to subtly inhale during conversations, a desperate form of biological defense. Smiling broadly was reserved for portraits, and even then, artists were advised to keep mouths closed. No one wanted to paint what lurked behind the moustache. Yet, somehow, love endured. Marriages happened. Children were produced. Proposals were accepted by people who had not brushed their teeth in a week, and still had last Sunday's coal dust packed under their gums like sentimental sediment. And just when you think it couldn't get more peculiar, Victorian folklore steps in to polish the absurdity. Because for many, a tooth wasn't just a tooth. It was an omen, a charm, a potential ingredient in a minor hex. The superstition surrounding teeth was as layered and crumbly as the molars themselves. By now, you might have assumed the worst was over. You've been pulled, scraped, powdered, bristled, and possibly serenaded by a choir of badgers masquerading as toothbrushes. But Victorian dentistry wasn't just a physical ordeal. It came with a side dish of deeply unhinged folklore. In an era where science was still shaking hands with mysticism and occasionally being shoved aside by it, teeth were more than just tiny ivory inconveniences. They were omens. They were tokens. They were the kind of thing you didn't throw away casually, lest something, anything, decide to collect them for reasons you wouldn't enjoy. Let's begin with the children, whose primary job in Victorian society was to die tragically, inspire poetry, or grow up fast enough to sweep chimneys. When a child lost a tooth, this was not greeted with an encouraging visit from a benevolent fairy wielding a coin purse. Instead, the tooth was often burned, not for ceremonial closure, but to prevent witches from finding it and using it in a spell. Because as everyone knew, or at least pretended to know, witches absolutely adored teeth, particularly small, slightly bloody ones. There were other methods too. Some families buried the tooth in the garden to promote strong adult teeth. Others tucked it into the walls of the house, possibly in the belief that the tooth would protect the home from evil spirits, damp, or roving dentists. A few even believed that if you swallowed your own tooth, it would grow back stronger. This may explain why some children looked perpetually nauseated, but the paranoia didn't end with childhood. Adult teeth, those rare, still-present relics, were treated with a reverence usually reserved for heirlooms and surviving uncles. If one fell out, or was extracted with the assistance of a wrench and poor judgment, it was sometimes kept in a locket, a molar, next to a lock of hair. nothing says romance like keeping bits of someone that have literally fallen off. The upper classes were not immune to this dental dread. Queen Victoria herself reportedly kept a collection of her children's baby teeth, which she labelled and dated like trophies or increasingly disappointing awards. This was not seen as eccentric. It was viewed as maternal. Everyone did it. In fact, some people had tiny boxes specifically crafted for this purpose, ornate, velvet-lined, for the discerning collector of one's own discarded anatomy. And while the Victorian tooth fairy, as we know it, hadn't been formally invented, the idea of compensating children for their bodily sacrifices was evolving. In some regions, the ritual included placing the tooth under a pillow with the hope, not guarantee, that a coin might appear in its place. But this exchange wasn't always seen as magical. It could also be a bribe to keep children from sobbing audibly for the rest of the week. Meanwhile, certain folk tales warned of creatures who collected teeth not out of generosity, but because they needed them, either to build bone castles, grind up into potions, or simply because they enjoyed hoarding enamel. One particularly unsettling belief held that if a rat stole your tooth and ran away with it, your next tooth would resemble the rat's. Nature's way of saying, next time, store it in a fireproof lockbox. In rural areas, teeth were sometimes offered to animals, tossed into the pig pen, buried in horse stalls, given to the family dog with a whispered request for strong jaws and loyalty. These were not practices explained by logic or veterinary science. They were gestures of hope in a time when dental health was slightly more terrifying than actual plague. And then, of course, there were the charlatans, peddlers who roamed the countryside selling powdered dragon bone. Spoiler, it was chalk. Elixirs made from bat wings. Spoiler, it was gin. And charms to hang above your bed so you wouldn't dream about teeth falling out. Because everyone knew that if you dreamt of losing teeth, someone close to you would die, or get married, or inherit a goat. The specifics varied, but the sense of unease was non-negotiable. So teeth, in short, weren't just biological tools for chewing. They were fragments of your soul, barometers of your moral standing, and possibly the currency of goblins. And once you'd lived long enough to lose them all, well, that's when the real adventures began. Because what better way to celebrate a toothless smile than with a gleaming new set of dentures made from your ancestors? You may be thinking, surely it's all uphill from here. Perhaps you've imagined a gentle drift into the world of modern dentistry, with reclining chairs, soft lighting, and trained professionals who don't boil tools in soup pots. But alas, the Victorian era had one last joke to play, and it came in the form of dentures, shiny, grinning, and deeply unnerving. Let's be clear, dentures were not new. The ancient Etruscans made false teeth from ivory and human leftovers. But the Victorians refined the art in a uniquely unsettling way by harvesting their materials from the freshly deceased. Yes, real human teeth, sometimes still warm. This charming practice gained speed in the aftermath of major battles, most notably the Battle of Waterloo in 1815, which left behind a surplus of teeth and an enthusiastic market. These were promptly gathered from the mouths of the fallen, soldiers who, while heroic in life, became unwilling dental donors in death. The resulting prosthetics were delicately called Waterloo teeth. Not a nickname that screams comfort, but it certainly makes a statement. These teeth were considered premium quality, youthful, strong, and presumably brushed just once before meeting cannon fire. Once collected, gently, with pliers and a clear disregard for boundaries, they were boiled, sorted, and mounted into plates of ivory or gold. These dentures were then sold to the wealthy, who delighted in smiling with the borrowed dignity of anonymous Napoleonic corpses. For those who couldn't afford the luxury of war trophy teeth, there were other options. Horse teeth, whittled into shape, walrus ivory, polished until only slightly horrifying, wood, was mostly a myth, but it wasn't off the table if you were desperate and good with a chisel. Then came the age of vulcanite, a hard rubber made from sulfur and heat, which allowed for cheaper, more durable bases. Vulcanite dentures became wildly popular, but don't let the term popular mislead you. Wearing them was akin to clamping a bar of scorched soap to your gums and hoping for the best. They were heavy, foul-smelling, and prone to squeaking at inopportune moments, such as funerals or marriage proposals. Of course, once you had your dentures, you had to keep them in place. Victorian dental adhesives were not particularly subtle. Some used beeswax. Others swore by a paste made from bread, gin, and quiet desperation. Still others simply clenched their jaws with heroic determination, hoping nobody would notice if a bicuspid suddenly launched itself across the dinner table. Care was another matter entirely. Instructions ranged from soak in brandy overnight to scrub with coal dust and strong moral fibre. Cleanliness standards varied widely depending on class, geography, and how comfortable one was with occasionally tasting something that had been inside at least 3 different people. The dentures, however crude, became status symbols. A full, white smile conveyed wealth, hygiene, and an uncanny resemblance to your neighbour's late husband. Portraits were painted, mouths subtly closed, to preserve the illusion of effortless beauty. After all, what was a little oral necromancy between friends? And if your dentures cracked, discoloured, or were accidentally fed to the dog? Well, you visited your local toothsmith, a man who often doubled as a blacksmith, barber, or enthusiastic amateur, and had them patched with whatever materials were nearby. Tin, bone, porcelain fragments, buttons, the occasional marble. They were not comfortable, they were not secure, but they were proof that you had survived long enough to need them. And in Victorian England, that was victory enough. Of course, not everyone had the funds or the patience for a full set of jaw-mounted inheritance. There are certain phrases that signal things have gone terribly wrong. "I'll just do it myself" is one of them. And when applied to your own molars, often in a mirror by candlelight, while someone outside yells about the rats again, it becomes less a personal decision and more of a minor tragedy in progress. In Victorian times, dentistry was not what we'd call accessible. It existed, certainly, in the same way Victorian surgery existed, technically and occasionally. The nearest professional might live 3 towns away, cost more than your rent, and demand payment in actual currency, something you hadn't seen since your uncle sold his prize goat. So, when toothache struck, many turned to the most reliable expert they knew, themselves. The home dentist's toolkit varied wildly, but creativity was never in short supply. A bent spoon, a pair of shoemaker's pliers, that mysterious iron key with no known door. And if none of those worked, there was always plan B. Tie a string to the offending tooth, and the other end to the nearest doorknob. Or horse. Or child with a strong arm and poor judgment. Not all DIY dental procedures were extractions. Some brave souls attempted fillings. They'd stuff the cavity with chewed bread, candle wax, or if they were feeling especially clever, melted lead. No one knew about heavy metal poisoning back then. Or if they did, they assumed it was the fault of ghosts or Catholics, as was the fashion. For the especially adventurous, there were tooth-whitening options. Homemade pastes of brick dust and vinegar, charcoal powder applied with a rag, and for the wealthy, ammonia-based concoctions that definitely brightened your smile and almost certainly thinned the enamel into retirement. Of course, none of this was done in silence. There would be groaning, pacing, and occasionally someone playing the fiddle in the corner for moral support. Victorians loved a bit of drama. If there was an audience, perhaps some neighbours who dropped by for tea and shrieking, so much the better. The spectacle of Cousin Alfred trying to yank his own tooth with a fireplace poker was basically the original Netflix. Children were often roped in as assistants. Hold the candle steady, they'd be told, or fetch me the whiskey. These little helpers learned two things very early. Never admit to a toothache, and never trust Auntie Margaret when she says, "This won't hurt a bit." To be clear, most of these efforts failed. Either the tooth remained defiantly lodged in place or came out accompanied by something that was never meant to leave the body. Gums were shredded, infection was common, pride was a casualty, and still they soldiered on, because the alternative was waiting for help that might arrive sometime between your third child's birth and Queen Victoria's next jubilee. But what about those who couldn't manage even this? Who lacked the tools, the courage, or the slightly unhinged uncle willing to help? They turned to herbal remedies, chewing cloves, holding garlic in the mouth, whispering to the tooth, hoping to shame it into cooperation. It rarely worked, but at least the cloves made you smell like someone who was trying. Naturally, all this leads us gently, hesitantly, and with the same energy as an infected wisdom tooth. The Victorians, as you may have gathered, did not shy away from suffering. They built railways across continents, wrote 1,000-page novels about buttons, and attended funerals like it was a competitive sport. So when it came to pain, especially the white-hot, nerve-searing kind that lives exclusively in the bones of your face, they had a few ideas, most of them terrible. Let's begin with the good news. They knew it would hurt. There was no pretense. No posters on the wall with smiling cartoon molars. No well-meaning dental hygienists asking if you felt just a little pressure. If you went to a Victorian dentist, the general assumption was that you'd be screaming before the door even closed, which is why pain relief, if you can call it that, was usually offered up front and with a shrug. The most common option was alcohol. Not a sip, not a dram, but enough to make your toes forget they were attached to your body. Gin, rum, whiskey. Pick your poison, quite literally. Some would even swish it in their mouths first, in the hopes that a numbed gum would translate into a less horrifying experience. It didn't, but it did ensure that everyone smelled faintly flammable. For the truly unlucky, or the enthusiastically experimental, there was laudanum, a lovely little tincture made from opium, alcohol, and the Victorian belief that everything could be solved with more tinctures. It worked wonders for making you forget you were in pain, or alive, or legally responsible for your actions. Laudanum could knock you into a dreamy haze where you no longer cared about your teeth, your family, or whether your dentist was currently using blacksmith tools on your molars. Still, laudanum was not widely available to the poor, which meant that most people went in stone-cold sober, gripping the arms of the chair, or more often the arms of a relative, and hoping they passed out early. That was the real secret, unconsciousness as a strategy. If you were lucky, the pain would hit a crescendo so intense that your brain would simply opt out, like a child pulling the blanket over their head and saying, "Nope." Of course, there were always those who believed in toughing it out. Usually men who'd once wrestled a goose and thought this gave them immunity to nerve endings. They'd grit their teeth, which is ironic given the circumstances, and mutter something about how their grandfather had a molar pulled by a cannon and didn't complain once. These men typically lasted about 20 seconds before howling like a choir of damned souls. Women, meanwhile, were considered more delicate, which, in practical terms, meant that they were allowed to scream as loud as they wanted, and sometimes even given a hand to squeeze. Not always their own hand. Sometimes just something soft nearby. A cushion, a relative, a taxidermied otter. Victorian homes had a lot of odd items lying around. Children were another matter entirely. They didn't receive anesthetic, obviously, because they were children and therefore not considered fully human by medical standards of the time. Instead, they were told to be brave, given a boiled sweet as incentive, and then expected to sit still while a man in a soot-stained apron attempted a molar removal with what looked like medieval salad tongs. The child would scream, the adult would panic, and the tooth, more often than not, would remain exactly where it was, triumphant and throbbing. Music was sometimes used as a distraction, especially in more civilized dental establishments. The idea was that a bit of harp or piano might calm the nerves. In reality, it created a kind of surreal ambiance, like being tortured in a fancy ballroom. 1 second you're hearing a genteel waltz, the next someone is yelling, "Hold his jaw still," and the sound of metal against enamel fills the air like a tiny blacksmith shop of agony. And yet, they survived, somehow, toothless, dazed, and deeply suspicious of chairs with straps, but alive. The pain faded, eventually, and they returned to their lives with 1 fewer tooth and 100 new stories to tell, most of which ended with, "And that's when the bleeding started." But before we offer a comforting sigh and imagine them sipping tea through clenched gums, let's not forget, this was just the procedure. Aftercare? That's a whole different flavour of horror, one that involves open wounds, home remedies, and several things that should never, ever be sprinkled on exposed nerves. Now that your tooth has been extracted, yanked, twisted, or outright shattered into compliance, and the shrieking has subsided into a polite post-traumatic whimper, it's time for aftercare. Or, as it was known in the 19th century, what do we have lying around the pantry that isn't already growing mould? Victorian dental aftercare occupied a delicate space between optimism and medieval superstition. On one hand, there was a growing body of medical knowledge whispering things like germs exist and maybe don't pack the wound with dirt. On the other hand, there was still your neighbour Gladys recommending crushed garlic, goose grease, and whispering the Lord's Prayer while facing north. Most wounds, dental or otherwise, were expected to heal via the natural grace of providence and scabbing. Infection, well, that was just part of the journey. If your gums swelled to twice their normal size and developed a smell reminiscent of a neglected root cellar, it was either a sign of miasma, sin, or that the humours were out of balance. You might be prescribed bloodletting for a mouth wound. In wealthier homes, healing involved a series of tinctures, tonics, and compresses applied with lace handkerchiefs and severe expressions. Camphor was popular, so was vinegar. Both stung horribly and accomplished very little, other than making your breath smell like an abandoned apothecary. There were also soothing poultices made from chewed bread, mashed beans, and whatever herbs hadn't gone completely yellow yet. You'd bind it all up in a cloth, tie it to your face with string or ribbon, and walk around the house like a very determined lunch parcel. In less affluent households, you were more likely to get a rag soaked in salt water, a blessing from someone's aunt, and the sage advice to keep it elevated, which was difficult given the tooth was in your face and not a sprained ankle. Lacking proper antiseptics, many simply relied on alcohol again. Not for rinsing, for drinking. A numbed mind, after all, was the only effective painkiller widely available without a prescription or basic human compassion. And what of sutures? Stitches were rarely applied unless things had gone truly awry. The idea of stitching up an oral wound seemed excessive. The preferred method was to let the blood pool, congeal, and form a natural plug. This clot, if undisturbed, would protect the wound while the gums re-knit themselves slowly, painfully, and often incorrectly. If disturbed, congratulations. You now had what we today call dry socket, but which the Victorians knew as a divine punishment for vanity. Swelling was a point of pride. It meant you'd been through something. People might nod approvingly at your bruised jaw and say things like, "Looks like a solid extraction," as though you'd just finished building a shed, not surviving battlefield dentistry. Swelling that lasted too long, however, became a source of concern, sometimes even leading to public prayer circles, for your face. There were those, of course, who took healing into their own trembling hands. They'd poke at the wound with bits of fabric, try to pack it with old tobacco because it draws out the poison, or even attempt to rinse it with their own homemade brews. These often involved strong spirits, garlic, and crushed charcoal, essentially converting their mouths into a tiny, haunted barbecue pit. And then there were the mouthwash enthusiasts. Yes, even in the 1800s, people attempted to freshen their breath. Not out of courtesy, but because even they could smell the infection. Mouthwashes might contain anything from cloves and brandy to sulfur water and urine, depending on one's level of desperation and the availability of privacy. Many of these solutions were more spiritual than medical, more about feeling like you were doing something than actually helping. To sleep with a dental wound was an exercise in bravery. You had to choose a side, elevate your head, and pray you didn't drool onto the bandage holding your poultice of shame. If you did, well, then you'd wake up sticky and your pillowcase would smell like old herbs and trauma. Some patients reportedly slept in chairs, convinced that lying down would invite further misalignment of their jawbones. Others didn't sleep at all, choosing instead to sit in silence and quietly mourn their enamel. And through all of this, you were expected to carry on. Go to work, tend to your household, pretend you weren't gently fermenting from the gums upward. Because dentistry in the Victorian era was not about comfort. It was about endurance, about survival, about keeping as many teeth in your head as possible until either you died or they did. Eventually, the wound would heal. Usually, the swelling would go down, the bleeding would stop, and the memory of it all would be tucked into the same psychological drawer where you kept your thoughts on public bathing and tax audits, something that happened certainly but best left undisturbed. Once your extraction wound had clotted, crusted, and stopped actively weeping, always a good sign, it was time to re-enter the world of solid food, or at least food-shaped concepts, because while the rest of your face might still be tender, swollen, or partially numb from brandy and unresolved trauma, your stomach wasn't going to politely wait for emotional recovery. Victorian eating was a chore under the best of conditions. Now add an open socket where a molar used to be, a jaw that clicks ominously when you yawn, and a healthy fear that anything too crunchy will send you back to the dentist, who may or may not be sober this time. Meals began with soft foods, gruels, broths, things you could sip without chewing and ideally without thinking too hard. Bread soaked in milk was popular because it was beige, wet, and unlikely to provoke an emotional response. Mashed turnips were another favourite, largely because they were too demoralised to resist digestion. If you were lucky, there might be pudding, not the sweet comforting kind we think of today, but the Victorian kind, which often involved sweat, spotted things, and a texture somewhere between cake and damp laundry. You learned quickly to eat on one side of your mouth, developing a tilted chew that made you look suspiciously like you were reconsidering all your life choices with each bite. Some claimed to master rotational mastication, which sounds sophisticated until you realize it just means slowly pivoting your jaw like a broken grandfather clock to avoid triggering your wound site. Of course, food didn't always cooperate. Stray seeds, crusty bits, and poorly behaved peas could migrate into the hollow void of your missing tooth, instantly causing a sensation best described as metallic lightning dipped in betrayal. This would be followed by a very dignified yelp, a napkin pressed theatrically to your face, and a long, silent pause in chewing while you reconsidered ever eating again. Cleaning the wound after eating was a challenge Victorian hygiene wasn't entirely prepared for. Toothbrushes existed, but they were made of bone and pig bristle, and weren't exactly surgical instruments. Instead, many relied on rinsing with tepid water, salt, or the ever-popular brandy, which served both to clean and to make you briefly forget that you were living in a time where meat pies could legally contain 0% meat. And then came the smells. Mouth wounds have an uncanny ability to ferment everything they touch. Combine that with 19th century food preservation techniques, which leaned heavily on guess and hope, and you had a recipe for breath that could frighten livestock. You might dab yourself with a bit of lavender oil or chew on mint if you were fancy. but really everyone smelled, and the bar for oral freshness was somewhere beneath sea level. Social meals were a minefield. Smiling was out. Talking was risky. Laughter could unseat the delicate clot that was the only thing standing between you and another long evening of whimpering. If someone told a joke at dinner, you'd have to suppress your mirth like a Victorian widow at a scandalous play, eyes wide, lips pursed, jaw locked in grim appreciation. Worse still, people noticed. They'd ask things like, "Oh dear, did you lose another one?" Or offer helpful advice like, "Have you tried boiling onions and tying them around your neck?" Which had no dental benefit but was widely believed to realign the body's magnetic fluids, or some such nonsense. As your healing progressed, you might graduate to meats. Carefully boiled, thoroughly overcooked meats that could be gummed into submission. Chewing still had to happen with military precision, avoiding the crater zone. But there was a sense of progress. You were regaining your confidence. You were biting again. Slowly, heroically, while gently weeping into your mutton. Eventually, you returned to something resembling normalcy. You'd chew on both sides of your mouth again. You'd forget for a while that teeth could be removed with tools better suited to carpentry. You'd even smile, just a little, despite the gap and the memory of distant, judgmental pliers. And just when life began to feel safe again, when you bit into an apple without flinching, another molar would begin to throb. A quiet, familiar ache. A whisper from the depths of your jaw saying, "We're not done." If you had a tooth in Victorian England, there was a good chance it was planning your downfall. Teeth weren't trusted. They were small, moody, and prone to betrayal with little provocation. And like a suspicious house guest who's overstayed their welcome, they never left quietly. But what if you could prevent the pain in the first place? That was the dream. A noble, profoundly delusional dream powered by superstition, inconsistent science, and a hearty disregard for bacteria. The first line of defense was hope. Not a strategy, but it counted. Some believed in divine protection, that a clean soul might result in clean molars. Others favoured amulets carved from bone or inscribed with symbols. If it jingled or smelled faintly of goat, it was considered medical grade. Then there were herbal remedies, not toothpaste per se, but substances rubbed onto teeth with varying levels of enthusiasm. Burnt rosemary was one. Crushed charcoal was another. Some even rubbed tobacco ash along their gums, which felt healthy in the way that repeatedly poking a bear with a stick feels safe. Saltwater rinses were popular, though the exact mixture varied. Some used tepid well water with a sprinkle of salt. Others added vinegar, cloves, or a dash of gin, depending on their station in life and how much they trusted their pharmacist, who may or may not have also sold leeches on the side. Speaking of pharmacists, the chemist's cabinet of wonders offered even more hopeful options. Tooth powders made from powdered brick, chalk, or crushed shells. Liquids labelled tooth elixir that promised relief, if not from pain, then at least from sobriety. One particularly daring concoction involved a blend of cinnamon oil, alum, and something called spirit of nitre, which sounds less like medicine and more like a potion you'd find in a cursed pirate chest. And let's not forget the tooth key. Yes, it comes up again. Because even in prevention, the looming presence of extraction haunted every effort. If your teeth ached too often, too dramatically, or too publicly, someone would eventually suggest simply removing the source of the problem, which meant that the line between prevention and cure was, in practice, a single shriek and a mouthful of gauze. But perhaps the most ambitious dental invention of the era was the mouthwash substitute, known sometimes as medicated rinses. One mixture included myrrh, tincture of opium, and something called spirit of camphor. You'd swish this around and then spend the next several hours wondering if your jaw was meant to feel tingly, floaty, or just loosely attached. There were also non-medicinal strategies. many of which fell squarely into the realm of lifestyle advice given by people who had all their teeth and too much free time. This included avoiding sweets, which was reasonable advice even back then, not sleeping with your mouth open, as if you had a say in the matter, and my personal favourite, chewing on the opposite side of your bad mood. Some insisted that emotional disposition played a role in tooth decay. That anger could sour the enamel, or that grief weakened the jaw. These theories were especially popular with those who couldn't afford actual treatment and needed something to blame besides poor sanitation and years of sugar masquerading as medicine. Of course, for all their effort, most Victorian toothache prevention methods failed in their central goal, to prevent toothaches. What they did achieve was a robust culture of oral superstition, a surprising tolerance for pain, and the invention of an entirely new profession, the Victorian snake oil dental specialist, who could relieve you of both pain and savings in a single visit. Still, people persisted, because it was better to believe in something than to accept that your mouth was slowly rebelling. And because as long as you could delay the inevitable clatter of your teeth into a tin basin, there was hope. Faint, slightly cinnamon-scented, but hope nonetheless. Eventually, all Victorian dental roads led to one destination: the prosthetic smile, the false tooth, the mechanical miracle that promised confidence, comfort, and the ability to eat a boiled turnip without crying. Sort of. Let's begin with expectations. You might imagine false teeth as discreet, well-fitting, and functional. That's adorable. In the 19th century, these were the equivalent of strapping a decorative fireplace to your face and hoping for the best. Their purpose was as much aesthetic as practical, and even that was optimistic. Materials varied. Ivory was popular early on, because what's better than taking the tusk of a noble beast and using it to gnash mushy vegetables? Not to mention, it had the added benefit of yellowing over time, giving your artificial smile the nostalgic patina of someone who lived entirely on tea and sorrow. Then there were human teeth, often sourced from the battlefield, lovingly polished and mounted in someone else's mouth. This gave rise to the delightful term Waterloo teeth, which sounds like a brand but was really just a horrifying trend. Don't worry, they weren't always fresh. Some had been in circulation, passed down, like heirlooms if your family crest was bad dental hygiene and a bayonet wound. But for those unwilling or unable to embrace second-hand molars, there was porcelain, lovely, delicate, and prone to making a sound like clacking marbles every time you spoke. A full set could be quite stunning, until you sneezed and launched one across the table like a tiny white cannonball. Of course, none of these materials mattered much without the framework to hold them. And here's where things get truly creative. Some dentures were fastened with springs. Yes, literal springs, which meant your jaw was now part mousetrap, part conversation piece. Others relied on gutta percha, a kind of early plastic derived from tree sap, or vulcanized rubber, which had the charming quality of absorbing flavor and slowly becoming more unpleasant with every use. Much like Victorian plumbing, adhesives were a topic all their own. You might use wax, natural gums, or simply hope your mouth's natural suction would hold everything in place. If it didn't, well, you smiled less, or developed a nervous tic that involved discreetly reinserting your molars mid-dance. False teeth were rarely comfortable. They pinched, they squeaked, they moved in unplanned directions, especially during laughter or romantic moments. And yet people clung to them, literally and figuratively, because toothlessness was a marker of poverty, decay, and having lost several arguments with aniseed toffee. Royalty wore them. Politicians wore them. The wealthy had sets made specially for dinners, for speeches, even for portraits. You might never own land, but you could own teeth, or at least something vaguely tooth-shaped. And then there were the DIY options. Cobblers, blacksmiths, and enterprising neighbours might offer you a homemade pair, crafted with care, guesswork, and the materials on hand. This could include buttons, beads, or bits of shell. It was creative. It was resourceful. It was a hazard to your gums, but points for effort. Eventually, you adapted. You learned to eat around them, to smile strategically, to hum when chewing, so no one could hear the gentle clack-clack of your synthetic molars finding their rhythm. You learned that dignity was less about appearance and more about carrying on with a straight face, even when one of your incisors had just fallen into your soup. And so, the Victorian era shuffled onward, with countless citizens embracing the strange, squeaky lie that their teeth were both natural and cooperative. They were not. But that was beside the point. Because in the end, false teeth were not about chewing. They were about keeping up appearances, bluffing health, and pretending, just for a while, that you were winning the war against sugar, time, and whatever it was that dentists actually did with those terrifying pliers. Napoleon Bonaparte had many qualities. Short wasn't technically one of them, but myth is louder than metric. By the time he returned from his charming beachside exile on the island of Elba, his resume included artillery genius, emperor, exilee, and part-time island homeowner with no chill. What he lacked in political foresight, he more than made up for in overconfidence wrapped in a tailor-fitted military coat. His return to France in 1815 was not exactly subtle. Most deposed leaders might ease back into politics, hold a press conference, send a few birds with scrolls, or issue a just checking in proclamation. Napoleon? He walked off a boat, pointed at the Alps, and essentially said, "This way to destiny." France, ever the enabler in its complicated relationship with revolution and regret, greeted him with mild panic and a growing crowd. Soldiers sent to stop him simply switched sides, presumably because there's nothing like a familiar uniform and a man with great cheekbones yelling about glory. In less than a month, he was back in Paris, back in power, and back to rearranging Europe as if the last few years had just been a weird dream everyone agreed to forget. Meanwhile, the other European leaders, known collectively as people who had been hoping this was over, met at the Congress of Vienna. This was a party so long and tedious, it made accounting look like a blood sport. They were sipping wine and redrawing borders when someone burst in, probably winded, possibly pale, and said something historically polite along the lines of, "He's back." They reacted the way you'd expect. Loud letters were written, armies were summoned, and treaties were consulted, as though those pieces of paper might actually stop someone who had once crossed the Alps just for the vibes. Napoleon, always the multitasker, began preparing for what would be his final campaign. He had roughly 90 days to reassemble an army, regain credibility, and try to convince the world that this time he would behave. He did none of those things. Instead, he gathered about 125,000 men. Many of them were teenagers, former prisoners, or anyone with a pulse and vague spatial awareness. The uniforms were mismatched. Supplies were short. Morale was variable. But Napoleon, as always, had strategy, charisma, and the uncanny ability to make a map feel like a destiny. He also had a plan. Of course he did. It involved fast movement, misdirection, and the hope that Britain and Prussia wouldn't quite be ready yet. That hope, as we will discover shortly, was misplaced. What followed wasn't just a battle. It was a series of polite military misunderstandings, soggy terrain, dramatic weather patterns, and decisions that would make armchair generals of the future weep into their trivia books. But we are not there yet. No. We are still standing beside Napoleon, he in his coat and his hat, one hand tucked just so, eyes squinting into the horizon as if looking for a better ending. He had been emperor, then exiled, then not. Now, once again, he was preparing to march, toward destiny, toward Belgium, and ultimately toward the world's most passive-aggressively named farmhouse. But before we reach that muddy field where boots sink and cannons sigh, we must first discuss the state of the ground, the clouds, and the mood. Yes, we must talk about the weather, because even for Napoleon Bonaparte, the man, the myth, the mildly caffeinated force of nature, no amount of tactical brilliance could outmaneuver a good downpour. Let us now drift slowly, like a French cavalry horse before lunch, into the damp and delayed moment where history put on its boots and stepped directly into a puddle, shall we? Before the smoke, before the screams, before the battlefield became a waterlogged buffet of cannonballs and confusion, there was rain. Not just a drizzle, not that moody, poetic mist that makes you want to write letters in a candlelit tent. No, this was the kind of unrelenting downpour that sloshes into boots, soaks through optimism, and makes the ground beneath your feet contemplate a career in soup. The night before the Battle of Waterloo was not a glamorous prelude to glory. For Napoleon's army, it was a sleepless, sodden slog into disappointment. The ground was so wet that carts refused to roll. Horses stood in puddles with the 1,000-yard stare of creatures who knew they were about to participate in something historical but deeply uncomfortable. And while soldiers tried to nap on damp rucksacks under makeshift tents made of future regrets, Napoleon brooded in his field headquarters. He was, by all accounts, slightly unwell. Possibly with hemorrhoids, possibly with dysentery, possibly just with the realization that things were once again slipping out of his grasp. But regardless of the diagnosis, one thing was certain. The field would not dry by morning, and time was no longer on his side. Across the way, the Duke of Wellington, Britain's answer to "what if a stubborn bookshelf were also a general," was also enduring the weather. Unlike Napoleon, Wellington was used to British conditions, which meant he was already born 30% rain-resistant. He surveyed his position atop a ridge near a farmhouse called La Haye Sainte, which would soon become one of the most unfortunate Airbnb experiences in military history. Wellington's army was a stitched-together quilt of nationalities: British redcoats, Dutch militia, Belgian volunteers, and a handful of Germans who presumably read the wrong flyer and showed up anyway. They weren't all trained, they weren't all sober, but they were in position, and they had, crucially, time. That's because Napoleon made a decision, arguably the most famous wrong decision involving wet dirt in Western Europe. He waited. He delayed the start of the battle by several hours, hoping the ground would firm up so his artillery could actually roll and, ideally, obliterate things. It did not firm up. The delay only gave the Prussians time to get closer. Ah yes, the Prussians. Meanwhile, Field Marshal Blücher, an aging, half-delirious warhorse of a man with the charming habit of believing he was pregnant with an elephant, a real thing, look it up, was marching with everything he had toward Waterloo. He had promised Wellington they would arrive, late, tired, out of breath, but they would arrive. Back in the French camp, the hours crept by like a soldier trying not to be noticed. Officers shuffled, drummers idled, and cannon crews sat waiting for the moment they could start dragging their instruments of destruction across a field that resembled pudding. Eventually, Napoleon gave the order. The battle would begin. Not with fanfare, not with divine signs, but with wet boots, soggy wheels, and the faint hope that everyone else had forgotten how to shoot. This is where things became complex. And by complex, we mean complete chaos punctuated by heroic charges, miscommunications, and occasional cavalry units galloping dramatically in the wrong direction. But before we launch into the thunderous ballet of musket fire and military confusion, we must first talk about the French strategy. Because every battle has a plan, even if the plan is, essentially, try to hit them before they hit us, and hope no one notices we're inventing this as we go. So now, with the weather only slightly less terrible, and the fates leaning in like nosy aunts at a dinner party, we arrive at the first real move on the grand chessboard. Cannons are loaded, flags are raised, drummers begin their rhythm. Let us shuffle now, slowly, damply, with one eye on the sky, into the opening moves of a battle that would shape empires, flatten ambitions, and forever ruin the landscaping at a perfectly innocent Belgian farm. Onward, then, to the centre, to the fire, to the part of the story where people begin to yell. Quietly, of course. This is a sleepy history. It always begins with a farmhouse. La Haye Sainte was one of those buildings that history seemed to trip over accidentally, then crash into repeatedly until everyone nearby was extremely uncomfortable or extremely dead. Originally, it was just a quiet little structure with a courtyard and thick stone walls, perfect for storing grain, sheltering livestock, and, as it turns out, becoming the gravitational centre of military obsession. Napoleon, still hoping that frontal force could carry the day, like it had in those glory days when Europe was young, uniforms were shiny and his back didn't hurt, sent wave after wave of infantry toward the Allied centre, specifically toward the ridge near La Haye Sainte. The thinking here was classic. Hit the middle hard enough, and maybe the whole thing shatters. The British and their assorted allies, meanwhile, dug in around the farmhouse with the tenacity of people who knew their only other option was running, and running was not really fashionable in those heavy wool coats. The King's German Legion, yes, that was a real name, held the farmhouse like it was their grandparents' heirloom teapot, under siege from clumsy guests with sledgehammers. The French infantry surged up the slope in thick lines, all gleaming bayonets and shouted orders, only to be met with musket fire and the stubborn realization that Wellington's troops weren't going to break that easily. Add to this the wonderfully demoralizing sound of British cannons returning fire with enthusiastic regularity. Artillery turned the field into a series of increasingly unfortunate craters. Cavalry, both French and Allied, began to circle and charge like enormous angry cats chasing each other through smoke, the air filled with powder, shouting, and the clanging echoes of history having one of its louder days. Napoleon's cavalry eventually charged as well, en masse, and possibly with more ambition than instruction. Thousands of horsemen thundered across the field in dramatic unison, which, had this been a painting, would have looked heroic. In reality, they overshot, undershot, or simply galloped dramatically at well-formed British squares, which repelled them by being incredibly boring but geometrically effective. The British squares, those stubborn little blocks of bayonets, were designed to poke and discourage horses, which, it turns out, really don't enjoy charging into sharp metal puzzles. So the French cavalry went in again, and again, and again. Imagine spending most of your afternoon galloping up to a group of men who are essentially a cranky hedge of spikes, only to be turned away by organised pointiness. Meanwhile, La Haye Sainte continued its starring role as the fortress nobody could quite keep. The fighting around it became so intense, so repetitive, and so absurdly focused that one could be forgiven for thinking Napoleon's entire strategy revolved around seizing the world's most inconvenient barn. Eventually, in the late afternoon, the French did manage to take the farmhouse. Unfortunately, it was already half rubble and entirely out of tactical miracles. And worse, just as Napoleon was starting to believe the centre might buckle, the eastern horizon began to rumble, not with thunder, but with Prussians. Ah yes, the Prussians, still not pregnant with elephants, but very much on the move. Blücher had arrived, not all at once, not with the neat precision of a marching band, but in steady, grim determination. The Prussian army began to press on Napoleon's right flank like an existential migraine. Suddenly, the battlefield that had been a brutal but containable mess was now a multi-front crisis. French troops began to shift. Reserves, already thin, were pulled from one chaotic engagement to plug another. Officers shouted, drums beat faster. Horses, once noble and impressive, now just looked confused. By this point, everyone was exhausted. Most of the soldiers had been marching or fighting or standing in mud for well over 15 hours. Many hadn't eaten, some couldn't hear. A few had started to suspect this wasn't quite the glorious military adventure they were promised. And still, Napoleon tried. In the evening gloom, he hurled his Imperial Guard, his last elite reserve, the veterans of dozens of campaigns, into the fray. It was meant to be the final blow, the hammer, the legend, but the hammer missed. The Guard marched up the ridge into withering fire and stopped. Then it broke. For the first time anyone could remember, the Imperial Guard retreated. The cry went up, "La Garde recule!" The Guard is falling back. For Napoleon's army, that was the psychological tipping point. Order dissolved. Units fled. What had been a coordinated, if failing effort, became a torrent of soldiers heading away from the fighting with the kind of purposeful chaos only a losing army can produce. Napoleon himself was forced to flee as well, retreating into the night with the wreckage of his dreams thudding behind him like a drumbeat he could no longer command. And so, the battle ended, not with a single act of drama, but with a cascade of exhaustion, mud-smeared confusion, and silence. Stillness returned to the ridge. The cannons quieted. The flags fell, and the names of those fields, Waterloo, La Haye-Sainte, Hougoumont, were stitched into the pages of history, muddy, bloodied, and deeply inconvenient for everyone involved. Of course, this wasn't really the end of Napoleon. He'd be exiled again to a slightly less scenic island, and he'd stay there this time. But for the men who fought that day, the legacy was etched in aching limbs, lost friends, and the peculiar knowledge that they had survived something monumental, though not particularly well lit or comfortable. And for the rest of us, we're left with maps, statues, and an unsettling number of souvenirs. But also with the awareness that sometimes the fate of nations hinges not just on genius or valor, but on wet ground, tired horses, and a delay of just a few hours. Now rest. You've made it through the battle.